Thanks so much for being with us here on Atlanta News First Plus. I'm Joy Lim Nakrin, joined today by Attorney Anthony Lehman. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Joy.
Mr. Lehman is really a guest in particular that I wanted to get on today because I know you practice in the area of construction law, and let's show our viewers some of the images that we have been dealing with. You know, you guys have been boiling your water over the last few days, many of you, amid this water main break, the repairs being done, but now the main has been repaired. The boil water advisory has been lifted, so that's the really great news that I can share with everybody. If you're not aware, you have been given the all clear to drink your water without boiling it. I want to also let everyone know that Mayor Andre Dickens said that he supports a plan to spend $5 million reimbursing businesses for losses during the water outages in the recent days, among other things. And also the city is going to begin installing artificial intelligence-powered devices on valves that can electronically detect and report leaks, according to the Department of Watershed Management Commissioner. Okay, so despite all this, and this is all positive stuff that I'm so happy to report, we do want to talk a little bit to you, Mr. Lehman, about liability. First of all, I mean, this is aging infrastructure. Can the people who built it be held responsible for this break?
Well, good afternoon, Joy. I would say the answer to that question about whether they could be held responsible is it's highly unlikely that the people who built this water main would be responsible. Not knowing exactly when these water mains were installed, though it's likely that with these being iron, they probably would have been installed sometime before about the year 2000, maybe 2010 even. That would be far too long in the past for any liability to accrue. For an issue of construction defects in this kind of context, you're really looking at about a 6-year time window to find the defect, and then sue over the defect.
Okay, so is that when you say a window, do you mean statute of limitations?
Exactly. 6-year statute of limitations, that's the window you have, even if there's fraud, active fraud to conceal the defect, you'd still only have 8 years from substantial completion of the project, which is the statute of repose, is what that's known as.
Okay, so the other question I have for you is, what about the companies who are supposed to do regular repairs and maintenance and just troubleshoot for this sort of thing before it happens? Could they be held legally liable for this break that's happened?
So that's a closer question. If they have the responsibility to oversee all of the infrastructure and be looking for leaks and detecting the leaks and trying to address the ones that could potentially break, if they have that responsibility, they could be held liable. Their contract would govern that provision, of course, and they would have that standard of care of understanding that were supposed to. They've represented they can do it, and if they don't, that would be something where they could get. The city might look to them and say, you guys missed this, you should have caught this, you owe us at least some money for the repairs.
Yeah, and if they don't pay up, maybe they could be sued, essentially.
Exactly.
So, I mean, really, the big thing is that it impacts residents, right? I mean, we talked about, some sort of compensation for businesses, but what about just everyday people? Maybe people who are elderly, disabled, people who have underlying health conditions and really rely on having that fresh, clean water out of the faucet and not having to go all the way to the fire station just to get some clean water. Is there liability there? I mean, could they potentially go after the city? How does that work? How do we hold folks accountable?
So I think the problem there is that it's twofold. First, anywhere beyond the city, it'd be too tenuous a relationship unless there's some liability within the contracts that these folks, like using the example of the people who are looking for the problems in the utility system, those folks, even they would have a very unlikely ability to get sued for this issue, just because they don't necessarily have the responsibility to the public unless the contract grants that. And most likely it's not going to. It's going to limit it solely to the city and their responsibilities to the city. In terms of the people versus the city, the issue you have there is, again, a little bit, there's always the it depends answer for lawyers. I mean, it's the thing that we deal with as lawyers all the time. Fact scenarios can be different. But as a city, the city does enjoy what's called sovereign immunity, which means it is immune from most lawsuits unless it has agreed to make itself not immune, make itself liable potentially for the issue in the lawsuits.
And generally, they don't do that.
Correct. I mean, they're not going to put our money as taxpayers in the way of potentially, being spent on somebody who has had a health emergency due to a water main break.
Yeah, I mean, and people do have questions sometimes. It comes up in various cases, such as, with the UGA crash, for instance. People have questions about why there is such a challenge in holding the government accountable. And I mean, I want you to really answer this, but essentially it comes down to who's paying the bill. It's us. We're the taxpayers.
Right. I mean, there's a lot that's done by the courts to protect the public's coffers, and everything from sovereign immunity generally, where it's just a blanket for immunity, and also what's called qualified immunity, where even if something wrong happens, if it's not something that is egregious enough to rise to the level of basically being a violation of the Constitution, most of the time, unless there's specific insurance purchased for the purpose, there's not going to be liability. That insurance is often key, because if you get hit by somebody driving a public bus, MARTA's going to have insurance for that. And so that's where they have limited their own immunity as a result.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So really, is there any space in which there's some sort of legal liability here? How do you hold people accountable?
I mean, really, you hold people accountable by paying attention to what's going on with the watershed itself, and looking to your elected officials to make sure that watershed is keeping up with its obligations to keep its system operating properly. That's really all we can do as taxpayers and voters, is pay attention.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. Since a lot of your practice is construction law, and I know that you're barred in more than one state, how does kind of our aging infrastructure and the issues surrounding it, I mean, how does it fit into kind of the broader landscape and, potentially even litigation in this space, I guess across the country?
Well, I mean, public infrastructure is frankly one of the more litigious areas, because it seems public infrastructure always has problems with timeliness and timely delivery, and often funding is more limited. You have contractors being selected on the basis of being the lowest bidder, the lowest responsive bidder is always the statement. And in that space, Georgia's not different from most places in the country. Atlanta's not that different from most places in the country in that regard. Watershed in particular, there have been surveys done that show that Atlanta's water is more expensive than a lot of places where you might think it should be more expensive. Out west, they've had a lot of subsidies to allow people to move into places where water is very limited, and therefore they pay much less for their water than we do.
It's interesting.
And one more thing that drives Atlanta's water prices, frankly, is the fact that we have had for the last 25 years a consent order with the Environmental Protection Agency, where the city has had to upgrade its storm water retention systems to avoid sewer spills into our rivers and lakes.
Yeah, and that's a whole other thing. We know about the lawsuit against the city for the aging sewer system, and residents, many of them in historically black neighborhoods, saying that they're dealing with all sorts of issues, basically sewage coming onto their properties, apart from rodents and other pests coming onto their properties because of this. I know this isn't what you exactly signed up for today, but if you have any comment on that part as well, that, with the infrastructure of the city, do you think that suit has legs?
Well, I mean, the issue that you run into in those situations is whether, the notice issue a lot of times can be something that can raise a little bit of a red flag. If you have an issue where, say, you're living in a neighborhood where it's old sewer pipes and they've burst, and you've told the city about it multiple times, that does raise their responsibility to do something about it. Mm-hmm. So that could be some liability for the city in that regard. Generally, the issue that you really do get concerned about is pricing all people of all incomes out of the city to where it's no longer a diverse city, and you have a city that's basically a bunch of rich people.
Mm-hmm. And when you say you're concerned about that, do you think that, investing in the infrastructure, which is expensive, could potentially do that? Is that what you're trying to get at?
Well, I mean, if there's not a way to find ways to get help from state or the national level to rebuilding the infrastructure, what are your other options? Your options are either increasing your rates, issuing bonds which make you increase your rates, or trying to go through a system of a public-private partnership where you then sell off effectively the right to collect on portions or all of a particular system and to pay back the people that build it. And that's not going to end well either, because they're going to keep raising their rates to make sure they get paid back and get a profit.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it is a concern, it is absolutely a concern.
Yeah. So what do we do? I mean, how do we were talking off camera before we started this stream about, just how frequent these water main breaks are, that it's almost a daily occurrence, and that we're essentially fixing the aging infrastructure kind of Band-Aid style. A break comes up, we fix it. What do we do?
I mean,
what should we do?
in some respects, the answer I think Watershed would give is we can only do it that way because that's the only way that makes sense. If we dig up our roads and end up having to repave all our roads to replace infrastructure that still works, isn't necessarily like super up to date, but it still works. It's not actively leaking massive amounts of water. Why should we do that? If it's not broken, don't fix it. That's the argument
yeah.
you hear. And then when it breaks, then you all hear about it.
You know what? That's actually true. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And maybe that's kind of the philosophy there. And it works until it doesn't work.
Right. I mean, there's always the issue you run into, though, is what you don't know. The use of the AI now to potentially predict, I guess, the potential for leaks coming in. I mean, that could be a good solution because it does help take a little bit of the human element out of the leak detection. But even then, I mean, if it's a small leak, you're going to just triage. You're going to pick the big ones to fix.
Yeah, but at least that can certainly help, because my concern, like I mentioned before, is folks who have medical issues and really rely on that clean drinking water. Of course, it's an inconvenience. That's why I bought this huge bottle of water. I was waiting for that news that we could drink the water, but I'm not so worried about that as much as people who maybe elderly, maybe disabled, maybe they really just. It would be a huge inconvenience and maybe impossible for them to get to the fire station to get their water, that sort of thing. They wake up in the morning, they find out, oh, I can't drink the water. What am I supposed to do? It's not so easy for everyone.
Exactly. I mean, it's. I guess the only thing you can do is hope that you can keep enough water on hand to provide for yourself for a few days in the case of something like this happening, which may be what you have to do. It's simply because we do have literally infrastructure that was started to be built like 150 years ago within the city.
Yeah, well, you came in to give us some legal advice. You gave us some other life advice. But it's good. It's good. Thank you so much. So, Attorney Anthony Lehman, we really appreciate you joining us with your expertise and analysis. Before we let you go, what kind of cases do you take, and how do people reach out to you?
So I tend to take on cases that involve infrastructure projects, for example, or everything from home builder cases up to commercial cases, large buildings of any kind, essentially, and road construction, any of those types of things. And I'm with the law firm of Hudson Lambert Parrott, and we're in Buckhead.
Okay, Hudson Lambert Parrott, and and I guess people can just Google it and they'll find out how they can call you and email you.
Exactly, that's the best way. It's hlpwlaw.com.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Attorney Anthony Lehman, for joining us with your insight and analysis. And, again, the great news here, the water is running again. You have the all clear to drink it. It is safe to drink. But obviously the concerns do continue, and it's a story that we're going to continue to follow here on Atlanta News First, Atlanta News First Plus. If you haven't done so yet, please download our free mobile news app to get updates sent right to your phone. Thanks for being with us.